Hi, everyone. I'm Raleigh Seamster, Program Manager with the Google Earth Outreach Team, and I'm joining you today from Huichin, also known as Oakland, California, on the traditional territory of the Chochenyo-Ohlone people.
And I'm Steve DeRoy. I'm Anishinaabe from the Firelight Group, and I'm joining you today from the Squamish Nation in British Columbia.
Thank you, Steve. So welcome everyone to Participatory Mapping with Google Earth. Today we're going to learn about the direct-to-digital method for participatory mapping developed by the Firelight Group. So we're very lucky to have Steve here from Firelight, and he's going to share more about how their method works. So Steve, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us what participatory mapping is?
Well, participatory mapping is a process of engaging community members to be part of the research process to lead the mapping exercise. And so we really found that mapping is about engagement, it's about people, and it's about telling a story through maps. And so there are some ground rules to participatory mapping. Sometimes it's called community-based mapping. Sometimes it's called citizen science. But either way, it's a process in which the community defines the approach and techniques to be used to collect and store that information. It heavily relies on community knowledge and the expertise of the community. It represents the culturally, socially, and distinct understandings of space and place. And the process really focuses on what matters most to the community, and that's really what drives the process. The output maps may be something that might be a conventional two-dimensional map, but also might be a really custom way of thinking about the map, like the picture that we're seeing on the right here. But either way, the whole process of participatory mapping is an effective approach for engagement, especially in decision-making processes. So we work in this realm of traditional land use and occupancy studies, and we use Google as our base map. And historically, what we used to do was we'd have to create these custom base maps. And this is an example of an area up in northern Alberta in Canada, where we had to create these big, pretty large base maps, and we integrated satellite imagery, and then we would bring those maps into a community and lay them out onto a boardroom table and draw onto those maps or onto Mylar sheets. And we found that the post-processing effort of this exercise generated a lot of maps. A lot of output maps would be produced, and those maps would be sent to me, and I would have to scan and digitize those maps and put them into a digital format. Around the same time, we realized that there was a new way of mapping with a new release of Google Earth. And when we took those topographic maps that we were so used to working with, we realized that you could actually look at these maps in a three-dimensional space. You could move the map around in a digital format. And what it did was it eliminated that digitization step of taking those paper maps and putting them in. We could actually enter the information directly into Google Earth. And so we developed this directed digital mapping method where we would project Google up onto a wall, and we'd have the similar structured interviews with those land users and knowledge holders. We would record the audio, the video, and save notes about each of those interviews and the data that were collected as part of the research exercise. And then at the end of the interview, we would save that map data as a KMZ file. From there, we would then convert that into a GIS format and use that information for data analyses. The tools that we used were not anything that you couldn't get at a local electronics shop. So we would get a laptop that had Wi-Fi built in, and then we would download Google Earth off the internet and have it installed onto the laptop. And then we would get a projector, and we'd have that as a tool to project the map up onto the wall. We would buy these laser pointers, and then we print out the interview guides. And we have these recording devices like a video camera and a Zoom microphones and some tripods and memory cards. And so we developed these kits that would essentially store the direct-to-digital mapping tools. When we were working within Google Earth, we would organize our data using folders. And under the Places panel, we created these folders and subfolders where we would store all the information. And on a site-by-site basis, we created a naming convention to store that information about that one site. And we would add notes about that site, including the dates, who was interviewed, and any other pertinent information. And so I just want to share some examples of a direct digital mapping exercise and results of the research. And here's one of the dynamic land use and occupancy data that was produced by a University of Victoria student, Courtney Mower. And this is an example of how you can then organize and visualize the results of those data sets. Here's another example from another University of Victoria anthropology student that identified the Innu of Quebec significant places. And as you can see with this map, you can enrich the map with photos and text and other descriptions about that particular place. And here's another example of the Wungan Territory Ethnographic Mapping Project, where you can see that this University of Victoria student had organized all the data using folders and subfolders and could then turn those layers on and off depending on what they wanted to look at. And finally, this is an example of the Sinchothan place names map by David Elliott, where they show all of those place names and using icons in different colors and organizing them into subfolders. And so I think these examples really illustrate the power of Google Earth and how that information can be visualized, stored, and accessed.
Fantastic. So now that we've seen some examples, maybe we'll dive into what skills you actually need on Google Earth to be able to create maps like that. So I'm going to show you a couple of the different features of Google Earth you'll probably want to learn how to use. So starting off, just at the beginning, Google Earth is a free virtual globe, and it gives you access to Google's massive database of imagery. You can zoom into any area on our planet and view the landscape in immersive 3D. Google Earth exists in 4 different flavors. On the web, on Android and iOS mobile devices, and on the desktop. And so today, Steve and I are just focusing on Google Earth Pro, which is that desktop application. It gives you access to advanced features that Firelight uses in their direct-to-digital methodology. And so that's why we're focusing on it today. But I did want to emphasize that the direct-to-digital methodology and participatory mapping could be used with other mapping tools like Google Earth on the web, another tool called Google My Maps, or other non-Google mapping tools. So this is not exclusive to using Google Earth Pro, but that is what we're focusing on today as a great tool for this methodology. One of the advanced features that you'll find in Google Earth Pro is the ability to turn on historical imagery. So not only can you look at a snapshot of one point in time, but you can explore the entire catalog of aerial and satellite imagery, in some cases going as far back as the 1930s. And this could be useful because you might want to see how our area has changed over time. If you're trying to understand the impacts of extractive or development pressures in an area, or maybe you're just interviewing a person who used the land many decades ago, so you're trying to show them a picture that looks more familiar to them than how the land looks right now. So using Google Earth, you can take anyone on a virtual visit to any place on the planet, fly above the landscape, zooming in and out and tilting and panning the globe. And this can help facilitate your interviews with knowledge holders and help them easily identify sites of environmental or cultural significance that they have used out on the land. You can then record those places that they've identified by drawing on the map using points, lines, and polygons. And then you can add notes and images to those places. As Steve was mentioning before, you can then organize all those sites that you're mapping in the interview into folders of various subject matters. For example, Maybe those are place names or animals or plants or cultural sites, villages, things like that. You can decide what kind of hierarchy you want to use for your data and organize that data all into folders. Once you've created your maps, you can present and share them with others. And it's really important to note that the maps that you create in Google Earth Pro will be stored locally on the computer's hard drive. And then you choose when you want to share them with others, and you share them as KML files. Any content that you create using Google Earth Pro, you retain ownership of the intellectual property rights in the content that you create. Now, you can also bring your own map layers into Google Earth Pro, and some of the common file types that can be imported and visualized on the 3D globe include things like Esri shapefiles or geotiffs. And this capability might be useful to you if you want to bring in your own base data layers for your mapping interviews. For example, if you have geographic data sets of waterways, territory boundaries, traditional place names, all these things can be imported and visualized during an interview to really help the knowledge holder orient themselves on the landscape during an interview. You can also use this to bring in data you might be collecting out in the field as part of your project, like GPS tracks or drone imagery. Or finally, you might want to use this feature after the interview. Let's say you have a map of where a planned development project is, and you want to import that and visualize that next to the sites of significance that were identified by the community in order to help land management decisions. So definitely a different set of really useful features that you can use for these interviews. So, Steve, I heard you recorded a direct-to-digital interview with a surprise guest. Can you tell us a little bit about who you interviewed?
So I was fortunate enough to interview my eldest daughter, Isabelle. And we went through the process of mapping, and she showed me some really great sites on Google Earth.
All right, let's take a look.
Yeah. Hello, and welcome to our interactive mapping session. I'd like to introduce my daughter.
Hi, my name is Isabel DeRoy-Olson. I'm a citizen of the Trondequishin First Nation. I'm also from the Lake Manitoba and Evanflo First Nations.
So thanks for participating today, Isabelle. We're going to be doing some mapping using Google Earth, and I wanted to just show people how we interact with the map. And so can you show me on the map where you might go and spend some time? You said you're from the Trondequishin First Nation. Where is that?
So that's in Dawson City, Yukon, up north.
Okay, so what we would do in Google is we'll go to our search panel and type in Dawson City. Oh, look at this, Dawson City comes up. And when we look at that, it shows it on the map here. Now, can you show me where's the place, the cabin that you go to in Dawson City?
So it's just over here somewhere. Here, do you want to? So it's just right there. Right there.
Okay, so what we would do is in our places, we'd add a folder. In this case, we're going to call it Isabel DeRoy-Olson. And we're going to store all of Isabel's data. So this is the cabin here that you've identified. We're going to add a place mark to that. And we'll place that map point right onto the cabin. And you can see the cabin outline is right there. And I'm going to call this cabin. And Isabel, when's the last time you went to this cabin?
So I think I went in 2019. That was before COVID. And I just go with all of my family and my grandparents and aunties and uncles.
Okay. And what time of year is that?
That's usually in the summer.
All right. Great. So we've just added a point there to the cabin. Now, when you're at the cabin, do you ever go fishing?
Yeah, so we go fishing in the Klondike River just along the shoreline right here. And that's usually in the summertime.
Okay. And do you know what kind of fish you've caught in that area?
I think grayling.
Okay. All right. So Isabel has caught grayling in the summer of 2019.
Mm-hmm. And before that too.
Okay. But 2019 was the last time you were there?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you're in Dawson, do you ever go pick berries?
So out front of the cabin right here, there's strawberries, and then over here on the path to where we fish, there's raspberries.
Okay. So we can zoom in a little bit closer and we'll just add those areas. So that right here is strawberries.
And my grandma grows it.
Okay. So we'll call this a berry site. And Isabelle picks strawberries here in the summer of 2019. All right. And you said the other place is raspberries on the path over here?
Just right there. Right there.
Okay. All right, and we'll call those berries. And great. Well, this is just a really quick example of how we can do mapping using Google Earth. And it's really exciting. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. And we'll get back to the training with you, Raleigh.
Wow, that was great, Steve.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun to do that with my daughter.
Wonderful. So I'm pretty sure that's not your first direct-to-digital interview. How long has Firelight been doing these?
Well, as a company, we've been doing these interviews since 2010, but I've actually been doing this kind of work since 1999. So
wow.
Actually 22 years.
Wow. Okay. So I'm sure you probably learned a lot. I'm wondering if you could share some of your experience about what works well, maybe some best practices around doing participatory mapping.
Excellent. Yeah, what we found in the process of setting up this direct-to-digital mapping method is that there are some elements to it that are really important to take into consideration. And I'm going to talk about this timeline of organizing the actual process. And I'll dive in a little bit more deeper into what the steps are required. But this provides a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in terms of best practices. So it's important that you collect high quality data. And I think at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're producing information that can be used not only for the project you might be working on, but also how you might be able to use it for other purposes, such as managing Crown land referrals or informing consultation and accommodation processes with governments, or using that information within a land use planning framework or other decision-making process. At the end of the day, your data should be defensible. And so it's important to follow your methods. When we come into a community, it's really important that we are prepared, and we want to make sure that we have everything organized in a way that's easily accessible and used. So for one, we make sure that we define our project goals. Two, we make sure that we establish the method that we're going to be applying and then the various mapping styles that we'll be using throughout the exercise. We want to define the area of interest that we're focusing on. Now, that might be a territorial-wide lens, or it might be looking at a very narrow project-specific geographic area. But either way, depending on what area you might be looking at, you want to make sure you have defined questions and methods that you're going to be applying. And then thinking about the mapping codes that you might use. So we use a coding system, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but we have over 300 map codes that we use for depending on what the activities are that we're collecting information about. So these are just some examples of some of the bird kill sites that we would use. We want to make sure that we have data about data. We call that metadata. So when we go and do an interview, you want to make sure that we organize each participant's interview data, the date of the interview, whether they provided consent, who are the interviewers and mappers, and just really document the process. And then when we actually prepare for doing a direct-to-digital mapping interview, we want to make sure that we prepare Google Earth and ensure that all of our information is organized We want to prepare the room. We want to explain the process to the participant, and we want to ensure the participant has given consent before proceeding. So when we talk about preparing Google Earth, we want to make sure that we set up a good folder structure that we can load in base data such as place names, road names, creeks and rivers. And this way that we can turn on and off those layers, so that way we can easily see where those places are on the map. In some cases, we're working in an offline setting where maybe we're invited to someone's house to do an interview. And so we want to make sure that we cache that imagery. We want to fly over the area that we're talking about and store that cache. They call it stored information. It's stored on your computer. Then you can unplug your laptop and go to that person's house and carry out the interview. Be familiar with the areas that you're talking about. Fly around, understand what are some of the key places that you'll want to ensure that are highlighted on the map. And other layers that might be important that you might want to include are boundaries, rivers, past work that the community has done, or other interview data. You might have information about an industrial development, or you might have information where you went out onto the field with a GPS, so loading those tracks and waypoints. When you set up the room for the direct-to-digital mapping interview, you want to make sure that you give yourself some time to organize all your information. You're going to have your interview guides, you're going to have your consent forms, you're going to have your laptop on the table, the projector, you're going to have all kinds of equipment. You want to make sure that you store your equipment and organize it in a way that looks neat and tidy, and when that person comes in for an interview, they sit down and they know that this is where they're sitting and they have the equipment to be able to do that. So just ensure that you have all of these elements organized in a way that that makes the room a positive research environment. And when you're setting up the interview, we have some checklists because we have many people kind of working with various communities. We have a set list of a checklist that we make sure that we follow, making sure that the equipment is all set up, making sure that we know where certain things should be. It's just good to make sure that you follow this and make sure that you're not missing anything. Then during the interview, you have one person that's asking questions. We call them the lead interviewer. And then we have one person who's managing all that information and that map data. And so we call them the mapper. So ensuring that people know what their roles are, and the lead will have a series of questions in the interview guide that they're going to follow. But sometimes people want to talk about different things. And so don't be afraid to deviate from the interview guide too much. But at the same time, ensure that the participant is feeling comfortable at times. Make sure that you're doing check the temperature of the room. Take a lot of breaks. Make sure that people have some snacks and are given some water or coffee, and making sure that they feel comfortable. The other element is, because we're working with a lot of digital technologies, don't forget to press the record button on the audio and video recorders, and make sure that you introduce yourself. And lay out those roles of the people that are in the room. Each of the interviews might take anywhere between 2 to 3 hours, and so making sure you take some breaks halfway through, and follow the participant. They'll give you some cues in terms of when they want to take a break, and don't be afraid to pause the recording at any time. And so there's some natural breaks in the interview, so you might want to think about how you organize your method to be able to make sure that you say, okay, let's do a pulse check, make sure that the participant feels comfortable. If they want to take a break, that's a great opportunity to do so. Some other reminders to think about are keeping a list of place names, spelling out all the proper names. So when someone has a name in an Indigenous language, get them to spell it for you. Get them to spell their own names for you. Don't assume anything. And so making sure that, because at the end of the day, someone's going to be listening to those recordings and typing it all out. And so making sure that, that you have that all spelled out for them. Ask questions. Sometimes you're in an interview and you're mapping a long linear future, and that takes some time. The participant says, well, you start at this river, at this lake, and you follow it, 20 kilometers down the river. Well, while the mapper is doing that, you might ask some other questions about what makes that place so important and how did they learn about that place, and really getting to the qualitative elements of that place to really describe not only the spatial element of that, but what makes that place so important. And so when we record information in Google Earth, we use the name field and we use the description field. In the name field, we have the site ID that includes the map code, the sequence, and the participant codes. And that way we can tie all the data back and we can organize it and we can really understand who's recording and what they're recording. But at the same time, on a site-by-site basis, we're talking about the descriptive elements of that site and notes about it. And we use what we call a data star. And the data star includes the who, the what, the where, and the when elements of that particular site. But also it includes the ecological relationship of that site, the kinship relationship, the teaching and knowledge transfer that takes place at that site, as well as how that site relates to other locations nearby. And so keeping an eye on recording these types of elements is really important to enrich your data. And at the end of the process, we talked about everything that leads up to the interview, but then there's a post-processing element that I'd like to go through. The first bit is managing your information. Make sure that you have all the signed consent forms. Make sure you take good notes during your interview. Don't forget to save throughout the process. Sometimes you just want to make sure that you save it and save multiple times. Don't overlook that. That's a really important piece. And then at the end of each interview, you're going to store a lot of information. You're going to be recording map data, audio files, video files, note files. So you want to make sure that you have a convention, a naming convention that's common amongst all of those. We usually use the PIN followed by the participant's name followed by the date. And so making sure that's all stored in your metadata sheet is really important as well. And then at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you store your data in 3 places. One on your computer or laptop, one on a portable hard drive, and if you have a remote server, one that would then be uploaded to that remote server. So we usually use the 3-2-1 rule. 3 copies of your data, 2 of which are local, and 1 at least that's offsite.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So for those of you who are watching and are thinking about potentially using this methodology or adapting it for your own work, I want to mention that Firelight has put together a whole guidebook about their methodology, which we're making available as a resource for this talk. So you can go even deeper on their methodology. So Steve, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us and our audience. You have a wealth of experience in this area. Any parting words for those watching who are thinking about potentially using this method?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. And we've been using Google Earth as our base map for direct digital mapping for a long time, and it really provides an unparalleled opportunity to explore the world. And then that combined with the community knowledge where we augment the map, it really brings that map to life. And so we're really excited to do this type of research, and we're really excited to continue to use Google Earth as our base map.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I find it very powerful that with some really basic mapping skills in Google Earth, communities are able to ensure that their values and their assets are really represented on the map. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience. We hope you all learned something that you can take away to support your community or the communities that you work with. And I'll just say happy mapping, everyone.